So last week, we talked about getting into the boat. And we discussed Peter and how being in the presence of Jesus and realizing his new identity in Jesus had changed things for him. And how the things that had mattered so much before suddenly didn't mean a whole lot. We talked about how Peter had been cleaning his fishing nets when Jesus approached him and told him to set out for deep water, and how he was willing to set aside the things that distracted him for the miracle that God was going to do. But then after the miraculous catch, Peter left that miracle on the shoreline because once his eyes were open to his new purpose as a fisher of men, once the voice of God broke through and he was listening, nothing else mattered. So this week, I want to talk about positioning ourselves to hear God. And I'm going to begin by reading 1 Samuel 3, 1 through 10. Oh, I don't have my clicker thing. Do you just want to try to keep up, or should I get my clicker thing?
You're getting express delivery.
All right, perfect. Everything's a little bit scrambled this morning. I thought I was gonna be able to do worship and things like that, and after we started practicing, it became very apparent that that was not gonna happen. So we kind of switched gears. All right, and hopefully this changes. There we go. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow so dim that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark was. Then the Lord called, "Samuel, Samuel." And he said, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "Eli, I did not call, lie down again." So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, my son, lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the voice of the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Before we unpack these verses, I want to tell you a little bit about how Samuel came to be living with Eli. I'm going to move this back just a bit, because it's important to how all of this fits together. And it gives us a picture of how God moves and orchestrates and uses our hardships, something that we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks, and how he turns them around and redeems them if we give God the chance. That's the faith part. It's the answer to the question of, will we give God the chance to turn things around, or will we become unsettled in our hardships? Will we become frustrated? Will we hold on to the pain and the difficulty and the anxiety? I've heard it said that anxiety is the opposite of faith. And while I think there are some nuances to that definition that definition doesn't take into account, I think there's still some truth to the statement. If we're anxious, we're in a place where we're not living with the belief that God will use our hardships and turn them to good. It's pretty hard to be anxious and at the same time filled with the faith that God sees a different ending, a better ending than we do. So in this story, Samuel is living with Eli the priest. And as readers, we know that there's some backstory here. It's pretty rare that someone young is living with a person other than a parent if there hasn't been some kind of influence or oftentimes tragedy that takes place. And the chapters that come right before this explain the situation. Samuel's mother's name is Hannah, and Hannah comes into this larger story of the Bible at the end of the period where Israel was ruled by judges and just before the implementation of the earthly kings for the Israelite nation. And in this transition time, the book of 1 Samuel begins with Hannah, who is a woman in distress. Hannah was one of two wives of a man named Elkanah, and she was barren. The other wife had children, and we don't really know the details, but Hannah was tormented by the other wife for her childless state. At this time in history, hardships were often seen as the result of a personal failure. So if someone were sick, it must have been because they did something wrong or they were morally less than they should be. For Hannah being barren, she would have been looked at with some suspicion. Still, she was loved by her husband. The Bible tells us in 1 Samuel 1:4-5 that when Elkanah made his sacrifice during their annual pilgrimage to Shiloh, he would give portions to his other wife and her sons and daughters, but to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, even though that the Lord had closed her womb. But the other wife provoked her because of this, and this went on for years. Also important to know is during these years, Israel was not strictly monotheistic. The worship of other gods through the influence of outside cultures had slipped into their own practices. And even though this time period is after Israel was delivered from slavery in Egypt and after the time of Moses and the 10 Commandments, in which the first commandment is to, come on, do we know this one? Have no other gods before me, right? And even though they would sacrifice at the right times each year, there was another god that had seeped into their practices, and that was the fertility goddess Asherah. And we know this because archaeological digs of these sites in this time period have unearthed thousands of tiny little pottery Asherah figurines that would have been used as offerings. But even though Hannah wanted a child, we don't see her accepting the false god that would have been typical to accept for a woman in her predicament. Instead, Hannah's quiet faith in the one true God led her to reject the false god and took her to the temple where she pleaded with Yahweh to give her a son. Eli was the priest at that time, and he witnessed her prayer to God where her lips moved but no words came out. And he thought she'd been drinking, and he chastised her. Now, there's a lot that we could say about a priest who didn't recognize true, broken, heartfelt prayer. But we'll see that dynamic play out a little bit later in the story. But when Hannah was praying, she vowed that if she were to be given a son, that she would dedicate that son to be raised in the temple as a Nazirite, as one who would be dedicated to the service of God. And God did give her a son. And Hannah named that son Samuel. This is the boy in this passage that we just read who is living with Eli because Hannah was true to her promise to give back the miracle that God had given her. This is a little bit off of our topic for today, but there's a common theme that we see in the lives of people who God uses to bring out the miraculous. We spend a lot of time in our churches talking about using our faith to stand on the promises of God. We talk a lot about praying for those promises to come to fruition. But in the Bible, we tend to see that those whom God has used to forward God's mission to redeem humanity are the ones whose faith went beyond standing on the promises and grew to the point where they offered those promises back to God. We see this with Abraham and his willingness to give up Isaac. We see this with Hannah as she brings her child to the temple to be dedicated to the work of God. And we see this in the New Testament with Peter as he left the miracle of his catch of fish on the shore to follow Jesus. So now let's unpack what's taking place in this story, starting with 1 Samuel 3, verse 1. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. The first thing that I want to point out here is Samuel is called a boy. This status has less to do with his age and more to do with his position as an apprentice to Eli. But we know he's young. And this identity as a boy in these verses is key to understanding this chapter, because this entire chapter is really about Samuel's calling and how that calling changed his status from that of a boy to that of a prophet. From this point on, after God calls him, Samuel is no longer referred to as a boy, but instead is known as a prophet of God. When Samuel heard the voice of God, it changed his identity. When we read this, we need to understand that when we hear the voice of God, it changes who we are. When you feel that tug in your heart, when you recognize that this is not all there is, and that you have a purpose on this earth bigger than you ever imagined, and that you are loved, and that you are wanted, and that you were created for this time and this space for a specific reason, when you realize this, it changes who you are. And we need to keep this in the background as we look at the rest of the passage, because the thing that we'll take away from this passage is similar to the takeaway from last week. When we recognize God's voice, we recognize our new identity and the purpose that comes along with that. That being said, the phrase that really stands out to me in these first few verses is that the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. We're talking about the people who God had made a covenant with. The people who experienced a miraculous freedom from slavery. A people who were given the 10 Commandments and the Ark of the Covenant, and who won incredible, inexplicable victories over their oppressors by following the instructions of God. But somehow, the word of the Lord was rare in those days. You see, Israel in this time had fallen into something of a spiritual stupor. And it goes deep. The word rare here carries the meaning of something that's precious, like a rare gemstone. The word rare, as it's used here, would have been a word that a merchant would have used to describe the piece on the table that held the greatest value. So the word of the Lord still carried value for them. It was seen as important. But the storyteller here is making it evident that the communication they had with God was being treated as something precious, but maybe not worth the trouble. Like when we go into a store and we see something we'd really like, but when we find out the price, we're like, nah. All right? Also, the line tells us that the visions were not widespread, and this carries an additional meaning for us too. Not only does it tell us that the visions didn't happen often, but also the words are infused with the sense that no vision was able to break through to the Israelites. You see, God didn't stop sending his visions. Instead, there were things in the way of Israel's ability to hear them. And this sounds really familiar. Can you think of another society that values the spiritual, but doesn't want to sacrifice the time or the effort to experience it? Here, one of those things that was standing in the way. One of those things that was standing in the way was Eli. Verses 2-3 tell us, at that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Now, Eli's dim eyesight here acts both as a way for the storyteller to tell us that he is old, as well as serves as a metaphor that tells us that he lacked spiritual insight. You see, Eli, while he wasn't a bad man, had become a corrupt leader who didn't attend to the issues that made it difficult for the voice of God to come through. Now, in this time, the priesthood was passed down generationally and followed the Levite line. And this is at the heart of Eli's sin. Eli's sons were corrupt. They took the best parts of the offerings for themselves, and they acted dishonorably with the prostitutes who sat outside the temple. In other words, They used the priesthood for their gain, and they lived as if they were beyond the consequences of their sin. Unfortunately, this kind of corruption might sound familiar also, because it's not a foreign concept in our modern church. But none of this is news to Eli. He knows of their sins and is even warned by another prophet in an earlier chapter of the cost of their disobedience. But he does not take steps to make corrections. And eventually, because of this, his line will become inconsequential in history. So Eli's eyesight is dim, but the lamp of God had not gone out. And when we're told that Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was, we have to remember when we read this that the ark used to carry so much power that it was closed off by heavy curtains, and only the high priest would enter into the room. And even when he did, there was concern whether or not he would survive the encounter. The typical person couldn't touch the ark or they would die. It had to be carried by special poles, and when they carried it into battle, the miraculous happened. It held the presence of God. It was considered to be the seat of God here on earth. Now, I know that there's reasons why certain people would be sleeping in certain places in the temple. Maybe that's where their beds were. But really, even with that reasoning, I cannot rationalize why, if Eli was the priest, he would be sleeping in another room while the apprentice slept under the shadow of the ark of the seat of God. And I want this to surprise me, but it doesn't. I'm going to meddle a little bit here. The presence of God fills this room every week when we come together to worship. But then we leave and we go on with our lives. And I know that we have to function in our world, but it seems like it should be hard for us to leave this place rather than what most of us do, which is look at our watches and check the starting time of the game or worry that we're not going to beat that other church down the road to the restaurant before brunch, right? And we're going to have to wait in a line. I hear you. And maybe that's because after Jesus made a way for the Holy Spirit to be active in our lives, and after Jesus made a way for each of us to be the temple of God, we don't have the same kind of reverence for a physical building. Because we know we carry the presence of God with us when we leave this place. And I'd like to think that that's the case. But then if that were true, I think we'd be a lot more careful about how we live our lives if we're the temple. We wouldn't be able to dismiss our sin, our own sin, as easily as we do. We would be heartbroken by our struggle because it's that struggle that makes it harder to hear the voice of God. I think the truth is that we're often much more like Eli than we are like Samuel. We're fine knowing the presence of God is close by, but we don't embody the importance of that fact. We're happy if someone else is doing the work of tending the temple, and we don't want to muddy the waters with our interference, even if we know something might be wrong. It's somebody else's problem, and we can live with that. And we know that the voice of God is valuable, but if we can get it from some other source, we're okay with that too. We don't have to sit under the seat of God. We don't have to take time to listen. We'll just turn on a YouTube video that tells us something that we already like to hear with a little God sprinkled into it, and we'll call that our effort to get closer to God. It's true. So that's our first question for today. Does your faith look like Eli's, or does it look like Samuel's? Does it look like Eli's? You know that God is real. You know there's something to it, but your eyes are dimmed by everything else going on around you, and you don't feel like you have the energy or the resources to make a change, or maybe you think this is good enough. I believe, so I'm probably getting into heaven, right? I'll tell you right now, for the follower of Jesus, heaven isn't the goal. The place of heaven isn't our reward for a life of good behavior. Eternity isn't a transaction. Our reward for walking closer to God is being with God. And we don't have to wait until we die to catch a glimpse of that. We can have more of that today. And if you feel like your eyes have gone dim, if you feel like Eli sitting in another room, part of the action, but not really part, knowing what the voice of God sounds like, but not hearing it often or really at all, just know now that the lamp of God has not yet gone out. The question is not if God is there. It's where are you? Are you sitting in the right place? If we're striving to hear God, the question is not, God, do you hear me? The statement, as we already read, is speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Verses 4 and 5 tell us, then the Lord called Samuel, Samuel, and he said, here I am, and ran to Eli, and said, here I am, for you called me. But he, Eli, said, I did not call, lie down again. So Samuel's sleeping near the ark, and old Eli, with his dim eyes and years of experience in serving the Lord, is in the next room. Samuel thinks he hears Eli call, so he runs to him. But Eli doesn't discern what's happening here and tells Samuel that he didn't call him and that Samuel should lie down again. So Samuel does. And verse 6 tells us that the Lord called again, Samuel. Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call, my son, lie down again. And in this scripture, there are two tiny words that I think break my heart the most. They're the two words that drive home how much of a sea of grays we are all navigating. In our world, the good guy is never perfect, and the bad guy usually is not all evil. And this drives home the point of how easy it is to fool ourselves into thinking our efforts are honorable even when they aren't. Eli isn't evil. Eli cares for Samuel. Eli calls Samuel, who is young and unsettled by hearing a voice in the middle of the night, probably a little confused and definitely wanting to figure it out. Eli takes the time to be kind and reassuring with the endearment, my son. Eli wanted to comfort Samuel, the one who would be chosen by God, the one God would use to try to turn Israel back on track after years of Eli and his son's careless leadership. And I think that this can be all of us. We can be kind. We can be good. We can do the work. And we can still miss hearing the voice of God. So it happens a third time. Verses 7 and 8 say, now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Samuel didn't yet recognize the voice of God. He hadn't had a personal encounter with God yet. So he runs to Eli again. Now, though, Eli can see what's happening. And he still does not go and investigate. A first point of interest here for me is that Samuel served in the temple around the priests, did the work that was requested, even had a relationship with Eli, yet hadn't had an experience with God. It is entirely possible to walk the walk and talk the talk and still not recognize the voice of God. But Eli had experienced the God. He had experienced the voice of God. He was just jaded. God, guard our hearts so that we don't become like that. So we're never in a place where we can see that God is speaking to someone else, where we can see that God is moving in the room next door, but we're not inspired and humbled by that realization enough to get up and go see what's happening. So instead, out of our experience, we're satisfied to give instructions to the person standing next to us about how they can hear God. Unfortunately, we do this all the time. We see God doing new things all the time, and we go on with our plans like nothing's happening. We see people at the altar healed, delivered from addictions, finding wholeness despite anxiety and depression, and we sit there and think, isn't that wonderful for them? I'm not saying that we can't be happy for those people who are finding God, but how on earth did spiritual growth become a spectator sport? How on earth did we get to the point where going to church and holding a door or singing on the platform or handing someone a cup of coffee became enough of God? If I am Eli, and frankly, as much as I'd rather not be, I think we're probably all a little bit more like Eli than we are Samuel. But if I am Eli in this story, if I've watched from the sidelines, and if I have done the work, and if I've ignored the places where I should have stepped in, and if I have basked in the lie that doing for Jesus is the same as living for Jesus, then I pray that when I get to this point to where I'm watching someone else grow closer to God, that I'm cognizant enough to want more of God myself, not just give instructions to someone else on how to find God. Thanks, Pat. I know that we read this story, and we think that we want to be like Samuel, and that's good. But I couldn't help but read it this time and think, dear God, how do I not become like Eli? How do I not take your presence for granted? How do I not become jaded? So this is the third time that Samuel's called by God, and this time Eli knows what's happening, and he tells him, go lie down, which is different than saying lie down again, because it implies that Samuel is to go back and wait rather than go back and do what he was doing before, which was to sleep. Eli here is teaching Samuel how to hear the voice of God. He's telling him to wait. And despite the fact that I would have loved to seen Eli at this point in the story go back with Samuel, I would have loved to see him want God for himself. I still love this detail because it shows us that God still had work for Eli, the old man whose sight was dim, to do. The grace for this man who had made so many mistakes, who had allowed sin and greed into the priesthood, the grace for this man, for all of humankind, should bring us to our knees. God could have gotten his message across to Samuel without the involvement of Eli. But God chose to use Eli, even though he had not been the most obedient or the most careful or even the most ethical. Even though Eli had allowed corruption into the priesthood, God still used him. And this is hope and warning for us all. I've said before that if you're a Christian, you are a leader. That's it. If you're a Christian, you're a leader. You carry a message, you have a mission, and even though we're flawed, and even though we make mistakes, and even though we sit on the sidelines and watch God work sometimes, instead of getting involved ourselves, God will still use us. God didn't give up on Samuel after calling 3 times, and God didn't give up on Eli after his failures, and God won't give up on us either. So Eli, this broken man who knew he would be replaced, who knew he was in danger, who should have been seeking God himself, instead instructed Samuel to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." So Samuel went back by himself, laid down and waited. And verse 10 says, "Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, 'Samuel, Samuel.' And Samuel said, 'Speak, for your servant is listening.'" And then God speaks. God gives Samuel a prophecy about the fall of the house of Eli. And then Samuel sat there all night with that word burning in his heart. And when Eli came in the next morning, Samuel was afraid to tell Eli what God had said, but Eli demanded that Samuel do so, and so Samuel did tell him. But it wasn't new information for Eli. He'd already been warned by another prophet, but it didn't make him address the problems with his sons or encourage him to correct the things that had led to the voice of God becoming rare for the people who once followed God in the form of a pillar through the desert. For real? It didn't make him address the problems with his sons or encourage him to correct the things that had led to the voice of God becoming rare for the people who once followed God in the form of a pillar of fire through the desert. After this event with Samuel, things continued on in Israel with relatively little change, except that God continued to speak to Samuel, and Samuel became known as a trustworthy prophet, which Israel needed. Because Samuel would be the one who would offer spiritual guidance when not too long after this event, Israel would lose the Ark of the Covenant, the seat of God, the physical symbol of God's presence and anointing, and they would lose it in a battle. You see, under Eli's leadership, the Ark had become little more than a good luck charm. Oh, could go a distance with that, couldn't I? Why do you wear a cross? Is it your good luck charm? Or when you look at it and you look down, does it remind you that the presence of God goes with you everywhere you walk? It was easy for the army to think that they should take the ark from Shiloh because it had lost they hadn't experienced its power. And they were under the guidance of Eli's corrupt sons. It was easy for them to think that they could win a war because they carried it like a fancy piece of weaponry that could intimidate the Philistines. Instead, Eli's sons and 30,000 soldiers died, and the ark was taken. So Samuel listened to God and became the voice for the people of Israel during this time of darkness and war and confusion. And when he was old, Samuel would oversee Israel's transition to a kingdom that was ruled by an earthly king. It's Samuel who would proclaim Saul as the first king. And when Saul failed to follow God, it's Samuel who would anoint David in his place, setting up the rest of the story for Jesus, the king of David's line, to fulfill the promises of God and become the final king who would introduce God's kingdom where that kind of corruption that separated humanity from God no longer had the power to destroy. I want to go back, though, to where we began. To the theme of this entire piece, to the first words where the author called Samuel a boy and then demonstrated his calling as a prophet. There are so many places in the Bible where we see examples of God calling people out to be leaders in God's mission. In the Old Testament, we see how God talks to Abraham and Moses and Samuel and so many others. But in these stories, God speaks to those he chooses as leaders so that they can spread the words that God has for the people of Israel. When Jesus comes, he expands the audience to include the Gentiles. And then when the Holy Spirit descends at Pentecost in Acts, once again, Every human has a path to hear God's words. And this is necessary because once we hear the message, once we know the truth that we're here for a reason and that God has a plan for us and longs for a relationship with us, we need that guidance. God no longer calls one as a representative. God calls us all. All we have to do is listening. But the problem is sometimes we make it difficult. We want our spirituality to be a matter of, did we do the right things? Did we volunteer enough hours? Did we avoid bad language? But none of that is the starting point. The starting point is, did we listen for God? When we knelt to pray, did we stop telling God what we want long enough to hear God tell us what we need? Did we stop scrolling through social media? Did we set down the physical evidence of our vanity and our pride and our greed long enough to give God a chance to break through? When you boil it down, it's what we say every week. It's about relationship, our relationship with God. It's hard to have a relationship with anyone if you never listen. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.